Great Books, in association with the National Union of Teachers.
Hello and welcome to Great Books, the most ambitious survey ever undertaken by Teachers TV. We wanted to find out which books you found most inspiring and life-changing, and I can assure you our top 10 is full of surprises.
Coming up, there'll be vintage courtroom drama.
You're just a bunch of lousy, yellow, stinking cowards!
A truly odd tale of murder and misunderstanding.
The policeman took hold of my arm and lifted me onto my feet. And this is when I hit him.
A classic novel with a sharp message for today. A Russian genius.
The Mozart of psychology.
A school where kids punish teachers. And a publishing phenomenon inspired by a train journey.
What a feast of delights. So how did we compile our Great Books top 10? Well, we posted a list of 40 titles on the web, but then you got to work voting and putting forward your own nominations, which makes this such a fascinating and exciting survey. But let's get underway and find out what's at number 10.
It's Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Brazilian writer Paulo Freire. John Richmond explores the rainforest roots of this highly influential book.
Here's a book born out of the brutal oppression of the poor in the tropical heat of rural Brazil. Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a Marxist text with Christian influences. Freire said, "Teach the poor to read and write and to understand the value of education by entering into dialogue with them, by finding out what they want to know. Don't do it to them, do it with them. Then they'll be able to participate in the transformation of society." And Freire rejected what he called the banking approach to education, which sees students as empty accounts waiting for teachers to deposit the currency of knowledge into them. Freire's approach produced some amazing results. On one occasion, one of many, he taught 300 illiterate sugarcane workers, learning in small groups, to read and write in just 45 days.
But is it still relevant to today's teachers?
Jenny Thewlis is here. She's an educational consultant to talk about Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So why this book, Jenny?
I think that basic message that you start from where the pupils are at is still extremely important, particularly in view of things like the very top-down model of education that we have now, which seems to conform very much to the sort of banking model that Freire was talking about.
You're not surprised then that it's at number 10?
Yes, I was, because I'd kind of thought that it was something that was probably a bit of a museum piece by now. So I don't know whether it's old 70s lefties that have voted it in. I mean, I hope it's not. I hope it's a whole new generation of revolutionary teachers.
The kids who daubed and spray-painted this remarkable graffiti might well feel at home in the school that inspired our next book. A school where kids rule the roost, where attendance at lessons is optional, and where lazing around is definitely okay.
At number 9, the story behind a revolutionary school. Summerhill, a radical approach to education by A.S. Neal.
A.S. Neal founded Summerhill School in 1921. It's still going strong in Suffolk. Neal's daughter Zoe Redhead runs it now. Neal's book about the school has sold more than 4 million copies in various versions and editions since it was first published in 1960. So what is it about this small, private boarding school that has attracted such immense international attention? I think I know the answer. Neal believed in self-government and freedom. Freedom isn't licence, he insists. Summerhill pupils come to understand the responsibilities that true freedom brings with it. Neil calls that self-regulation. Of course, the school's had its detractors and no end of lurid headlines down the years about pupils bathing in the nude, declaiming Shakespeare to cows, and even decapitating a rabbit. I know that most teachers won't do exactly what Neil and his family and colleagues have done. But we do think maybe that we can take something from Neil's beliefs and practices and apply it to our own more tightly controlled working lives.
The book certainly guided one former Summerhill teacher on his first day at the school.
I was extremely nervous. I'd just read the book on the train, so I knew nothing about school until I read the book. And then when I entered the gates, I was so nervous of getting out of the car. The idea of children being able to do what they liked was rather scary.
Was it chaotic?
Yes. If you're a teacher and you define your job as someone who delivers to children, then you would find it very, very difficult to be there. You've got to live the experience. You're equal in the community. You're a member of the community. Like, I caused a girl to cry in my classroom. I was telling her off during my science lesson, and I was fined. She walked out, and then she brought me to the meeting, and the whole school discussed me, and they all voted that I should water the grass for half an hour.
So were you surprised to find this book in the list?
No, I was very pleased to find it. I mean, to me, it's one of the most significant books about any school ever published.
Well, I found a really big fan of our next book. He's not a teacher, but he acquires and sells some fascinating collections of books down here at the South Bank Centre. He's been here for over 20 years. He is Bookseller Bob. Hello.
Hi.
Now, without giving the game away, give us a few clues about our next book.
Well, it's one of my favourite books. It's this author's shortest book, and it's short because he has something to say. He gets in, he gets out, it's over. Sells well. I don't think it's many people's favourite, but it's a hell of a book. And it's an indictment of the Victorian educational system.
OK, enough clues. Let's find out now what's at number 8.
A book written more than 150 years ago, but still startlingly relevant today. It's Hard Times by Charles Dickens.
Now, what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. So runs one of the most famous openings of any English novel, an opening which has particular appeal if the reader happens to be a teacher. Charles Dickens's Hard Times, first published in 1854 in weekly instalments in his magazine Household Words, is a bitter and high-spirited satire on the cruelties and divisions which the Industrial Revolution had brought to the mill towns of the north of England. Mr. Gradgrind's school imposes on its pupils the same heartless disciplines that the mill owners impose on their workers. The moral purpose of the book is to show the disasters which follow when the instincts of the heart are crushed and people's humanity is forgotten. Chapter 8 of the first part of the book is entitled Never Wonder. Mr. Gradgrind, still in love with facts at this point, overhears his daughter Louisa saying to her brother, "Tom, I wonder," and he reproves her with, "Louisa, never wonder." Now that school inspectors go around schools looking for evidence of awe and wonder, perhaps we've made a bit of progress.
So, a book from the Victorian age that speaks for today.
Some of the things that Dickens was writing about, perhaps as a kind of science fiction, have actually come to pass. You know, we do have schools in which children are drilled and grilled. We do have towns that are polluted and dark and in whose houses people just die and are never thought of again.
So when you see this book in the list, do you feel that it's a very important message to teachers today that they should be reading Hard Times?
I think so. I think the main message is that education has to be more than a study of facts and a study of ologies.
Now, I said there'd be a few surprises in the countdown to our Great Books Top 10, but who would have thought that a book written in the Soviet Union more than 70 years ago and suppressed by Stalin would be our next entry?
At number 7, it's been called a work of genius. Thought and Language by psychologist Lev Vygotsky.
Thought and Language is a hard book. I think I've read it 4 times in my life so far, and there are still big sections of it I don't understand. But the parts I do understand continue to amaze me by their explanatory power. Lev Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist and a genius. He died of tuberculosis in 1934 at the age of 38. Vygotsky says that all previous understandings of the relationship between thought and language are inadequate because they're static. He put forward a dynamic developmental model of the learning brain. When small children are playing, they often keep up a running commentary on what's happening. And now the train's going around the tower, and now it's bumping into the tower, and oh no, the tower's falling down! Vygotsky says that this kind of egocentric speech, Piaget's famous phrase, goes underground as children get older and becomes inner speech. Inner speech flutters in the learner's brain between pure thought and explicit language. The development of thought is driven by the language of the child and vice versa. Hence, so much emphasis today on the importance of valuing children's talk. Soon after Vygotsky's death, his theories fell foul of the Soviet authorities. They were condemned as bourgeois and idealist and suppressed. But after the death of Stalin, Vygotsky's writings were released, and in 1962, Thought and Language was published in English. In musical terms, Vygotsky had written a new score for the brain. No wonder one writer has called him the Mozart of psychology.
This book has to be on this list. It's probably one of the books that's most influenced how people who work with young children have worked with them over the last 10, 15, 20 years. You couldn't have a list like this without having Vygotsky there. I think there are 2 main things that come through the book. One of them is the really close association he drew out between all the chatter that happens with children and how their thinking's developed. And if the language isn't there, that has a real impact on how children think. And the other thing is Vygotsky was the first person who challenged the whole Piaget view that you have to wait for children to get to it. Because what he said is children can do a lot more if they've got an adult helping them.
Thought and Language is a very difficult book to read by comparison with some of the others that are in your list, and I doubt that many people have actually struggled to get from the start of it to the end of it, but the messages that it contains are absolutely vital to our thinking about how children learn.
Prior to Vygotsky, we'd really had a vision of the child as an active learner and an explorer, but a child who was really quite passive and who couldn't be taught anything new until they were ready to do so. So we were waiting for that progression. Vygotsky actually blew that away by saying that very young children are capable of very sophisticated thinking if they had the adults who could actually scaffold that learning and provide the right context.
Our next author was on a crowded train between Manchester and London when suddenly an idea formed in her mind. So far, she's sold over 300 million books and become a billionaire. But most importantly, she's widely credited with getting kids to read again. You could say it's nothing short of magical.
Soaring into 6th place, it's the very first story from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling.
Now, what, you may ask, is the single most popular children's book of recent years doing in 6th place in a survey of great books which have influenced teachers? Has Lord Voldemort's evil power been clouding your judgment? Or has he even managed to penetrate the secrets of the great book's online voting system? No. The answer lies in one of the comments you left on the website.
This book took me back to my childhood, to nights spent under the duvet with a torch, to magical mystery and fantasy. For my own children and my class, it was the start of a fresh, new interest in books.
And if you still doubt the Potter effect, just see how children's faces light up when you ask them about this wonderful wizard.
I like the wizards when they do magic in the Goblet of Fire at the start.
I've read all the Harry Potter books and I like them because they're really interesting and adventurous.
I'm reading the Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and it's a really good book. I read Harry Potter books much quickly than other books because they're so exciting. There's no pictures in it, but it's good to read.
So there you have it, the power and pleasure of reading, pure and simple. Well done, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Of course, I pay no attention to all the nonsense in the book about magic and wizardry. I mean, invisibility cloaks? Who'd believe it?
Why should Harry Potter be in this book list, do you think?
For a number of reasons. It's a fantastic story. I mean, you've got dwarves and giants and goblins, you know, what more do you want in a good story? But it's not just the story, it's the impact it's had on adults. Because I think for the first time in a long time, you've had a children's book being read by adults, and adults being quite proud of the fact that they've read Harry Potter. And it also enables a shared reading experience. Adults and children can talk about a story. I think that's very important for encouraging children to read more.
Interesting to see Harry Potter there, not surprising of course, but delighted to see it there because anything that gets children reading, especially boys, is always going to get my vote.
A book like Harry Potter gets kids to use their imaginations again and try to create images in their own heads, and they can take that as far as they want to.
Much of the writing in Harry Potter fits exactly the criteria for level 4, which is the age you should be at 11.
I think J.K. Rowling has that magic touch of writing in a way that is appealing both to children and to adults.
We've reached halfway in our top 10 countdown of great books. Join us in part 2 when we'll be revealing the final 5, and I'm going to tease you with a few clues as we head for the break.
Counting Cars, a novel link to Sherlock Holmes. A book title that can cause offence.
I hate that title more than anything else. It shows contempt for children in my book.
And what Oscar-winning story can she be talking about?
We were forced to read it. It was that or the Bible.
Great Books, in association with the National Union of Teachers.
Welcome back. You're watching Great Books. We asked you which books had inspired you the most during your educational careers, and you've been busy voting on the web. So far, there's been a heady mix of fact, fiction, self-help and psychology, Harry Potter alongside pedagogy of the oppressed. Quite amazing. Here's where we've got to.
At number 10, a revolutionary way of looking at education, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. Number 9, A School Where Kids Rule, OK, Summerhill by A.S. Neal. In at 8, a biting satire on schools, Hard Times by Charles Dickens. At 7, the book suppressed by Stalin, Thought and Language by Lev Vygotsky. And at number 6, spellbinding sorcery in the form of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling.
Now a book that turned the way we think about children upside down. Oof, that's better. It's a groundbreaking piece of work, highly valued by those who teach the very young. One teacher who voted for us told us, if you only ever read one child psychology book, this should be the one.
At number 5, a book that radically changed the way we think young children learn. Children's Minds by Margaret Donaldson.
Children's Minds is short, 120 pages, but it packs big ideas into a small space. And when I say big, I mean really big. So, what's it all about? Donaldson criticises the artificial nature of some of the activities on which Piaget based his theories. She shows that young children can perform demanding intellectual tasks as long as those tasks are grounded in realities that they understand. For example, in one of Piaget's most famous experiments, if young children are shown 6 toy cows, 4 black, 2 white, and are asked the question, are there more black cows or more cows? Most young children will answer, there are more black cows. But if the cows are laying on their sides, and if the children are told that the cows have gone to sleep, and they're then asked the question, are there more black cows or more sleeping cows? Most young children will give the right answer. So the challenge for teachers is to recognise that kind of understanding linked to children's experience, and then to help them towards a grasp of more abstract or disembedded forms of learning. And Donaldson warns that we're making trouble for ourselves if we continue to value the academic over the practical. If we make that mistake, a lot of these enthusiastic learners will end up leaving school with a sense of failure and resentment. And we don't want that, do we?
Many of you told us Margaret Donaldson's book really made a difference.
I knew it was a really important book in my life, but I didn't realise quite how important until I found it on my dusty shelf and got the original copy here and started reading it again and thought, goodness me, everything is just as powerful today as it was when I first read it 30 years ago. So it really was quite a life-changing book.
Did this book in any way change your attitude towards how you taught children?
As I think anybody who'd worked with very young children had known, really, that very young children are capable of incredibly sophisticated thinking and much more sophisticated ideas than we'd previously thought.
I'm really pleased to see Children's Minds in the top 10 because it's a book that changed our view of how children's learning might work.
Come here, pay attention and listen. Well, I couldn't quite keep it up, but that was my attempt at the deadly stare, one of the classroom tips in our next entry. Now, there must be hundreds of self-help teaching manuals on the market, but this is the only one that made it into our top 10.
At number 4, a book with a title you either love or loathe, Getting the Buggers to Behave by former teacher Sue Cowley.
It's a war out there, and we need to use every single weapon we have at our disposal. The typically forthright words of Sue Cowley. Her book, Getting the Buggers to Behave, is effectively a manual on how to fight that war. It's a practical, no-nonsense guide that helps teachers face up to the challenge of student behaviour in a way that very few books have done. The book is full of advice about the geography of the classroom, how to arrange the tables and chairs, and about the psychology of behaviour management. Keep calm, be assertive, not defensive, be polite, give respect, demand respect. This book has what you might call the grimy ring of truth to it, as befits an author who's done the job herself. So don't expect a grand text about the nobility of education. This is about getting from 9 to 4, from Monday to Friday, from September to half-term, to Christmas, to Easter, to July, with your self-esteem intact and with a growing pride and pleasure in the job you do.
When I first read the book, I thought to myself that finally I now have something that I can go to for help and advice as to what I'm going with, what I'm dealing with at the moment.
Why particularly? What is it about it?
What I like about it is that it's a proactive approach to behavior management, and something that I had to teach myself was learning how to be calm. Never taking it personally allowed me the opportunity to kind of step outside of myself and say, this behavior isn't aimed at me, this behavior is aimed at the teacher presence.
Purely for the title, I would put Getting the Buggers to Behave at the bottom of the list. Calling school children buggers, I don't really think it's a very nice marketing device.
I hate that title more than anything else. It shows contempt for children in my view.
It's humorous. I mean, if you could ask a lot of teachers in the real world what they would think about some of their challenging students, I'm sure you'd have a lot more derogatory terms than the word bugger.
Our next entry won some sparkling plaudits on the Great Books website. Somebody said it should be compulsory reading for every trainee teacher, and another cheekily added that any politician involved in educational policy should be forced to read it too.
It's number 3 in our top 10, a truly pioneering, thought-provoking book, How Children Fail by John Holt.
John Holt's How Children Fail was first published in America in 1964. Holt argues that schools fail children by discouraging their natural thirst for learning, by humiliating and frightening them. The solution he comes to at the end of the book: abolish school. It was a radical and dramatic conclusion born out of Holt's experience of teaching. His first school job was here in the canteen, but he didn't stay cooking for long. This World War II veteran with a Harvard degree soon switched to the classroom and taught language and maths. And it was here, in the classroom, that Holt developed his theories about the failings of schools. He and a colleague observed one another's teaching, quite an unusual thing to do in those days. These observations led Holt to write, "Infants are not stupid, and children come to school curious. But to a very great degree, school is a place where children learn to be stupid." Strong stuff. And this despite the fact that he was teaching in so-called progressive private schools. How Children Fail has sold more than 1 million copies. It reads now a bit like a cry from the past, rooted in 1960s notions of counterculture. But the book, with its wise human insights into the conditions which do and do not make for effective learning, has influenced 2 generations of teachers.
This book deserves to be in the list because it's a book which stands behind the head of the child and tells you what things look like from there. In particular, it tells you some of the home truths that teachers mostly try to avoid and mostly don't hear after they've been teaching for a while. I remember getting some children to talk to me about what it was like to be a remedial reader. And I remember one Year 6 girl saying to me clearly, teachers like us to read out loud so that they can make fun of us when we go wrong. And I think that pulled me up short and sharp because that was a really good example of what John Holt had been talking about.
The generation of teachers who are nearing retirement have a great deal of kind of loyalty towards this book. It was, I think, the centre of many of the child-centred arguments. And as such, yes, morally it has a really straight and true compass, but its relevance to today's society is really marginal.
It was one of those books that hits you between the eyes and you say, yes, this is really how it is, and you nod your head as you read it and say, yes, there's a lot of truth in this.
We're very close now to revealing our top great book, but hot on its heels was our next entry, and I'm not surprised because it is truly a remarkable piece of work. It's won 16 literary prizes, been published in 42 countries and sold over 10 million copies. Here are just a few of your comments that you've posted on the web. Thought-provoking, insightful, inspiring, fabulous, and a fantastic read.
And the book that climbed to number 2 is a very unusual murder mystery, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon.
Imagine being inside the head of an autistic boy. It's a confusing, frightening world which seems to lack all meaning, and where the obsessive following of rules and attention to detail is the only thing that gives any sense of security. That's where Mark Haddon places us in his remarkable book, which is by turns very funny and very sad. It's a tour de force of imagination and empathy in portraying the world as Christopher Boone, who has Asperger's syndrome, perceives it. Christopher is 15 years, 3 months and 2 days old, and he's investigating a murder of his neighbour's dog.
Did you kill the dog? He asked. I said I did not kill the dog. The policeman took hold of my arm and lifted me onto my feet. I didn't like him touching me like this. And this is when I hit him.
Christopher is typical of many people on the autistic spectrum. He has to stick to set patterns. It's only going to be a good day if he sees red cars on his way to school. The more red cars, the better the day. He knows a very great deal about maths and very little about the way other human beings think and feel. This book was a revelation to me. It avoids the pitfall of provoking pity for disability in the reader. We don't feel sorry for Christopher, we feel respect and even admiration. And if you're wondering about the book's unusual title, it's a quotation from a remark by Sherlock Holmes in a short story called Silver Blaze. Christopher solves the mystery, as does Holmes. The book's a detective story and a lot more than that.
Mark Haddon enables the reader to get into the mind of a child with Asperger's, and for the first time I could really understand what it felt like to be Christopher Boone and how difficult the world was, how scary and bewildering it was, because he saw things differently from the rest of us.
It makes the condition live, and it helps people to see that this is a very real situation. People like this, young people like this, are in school all the time and they're being misinterpreted and misunderstood. I've often used it with people with Asperger's syndrome to help them understand themselves. They make that identification and it helps develop their own self-awareness.
It's funny, it's perceptive. Mark Haddon writes with insight, but he doesn't write in a sentimental way, and he doesn't give Christopher any self-pity at all. So that makes it a fascinating read. I remember being moved and shocked by this book, and it was probably the first serious children's book that I'd read.
I like books that give the story of the child and from the viewpoint of the child, and I think the biggest problem with schools today is that people are not putting themselves in the place of the child.
Probably most teachers, when they read it, they find a refocus of exactly the complexity of learning for some kids. It will remind them of the many different ways to unlock the mind.
Almost there, just moments away from revealing the top entry in our Great Books survey. But before we do, let's remind ourselves of the inspirational and riveting reads that made it into our top 10.
At number 10, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. In at 9, A.S. Neil's account of his unique school, Summerhill. At number 8, Dickens with Hard Times. 7, Thought and Language by the psychologist Vygotsky. At 6, J.K. Rowling rekindles reading with Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Up there at number 5, Children's Minds by Margaret Donaldson. At 4, Getting the Buggers to Behave, Self-Help with Sue Cowley. In at 3, How Children Fail by John Holt. And in second place, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon.
So what does this list tell us about teachers? Who better to ask than the man who had a hand in devising the survey?
A picture starts to emerge of what teachers think is their philosophy of education. And in one single sentence, that philosophy is, the children are now the teachers. So if you just superficially look at the books, you would say they are the books you'd expect. But they're not. It shows us something about a really deep philosophy of child-centeredness that isn't just about the 1960s permissive child-centeredness, but a belief, an actual philosophical belief that children can teach you more than you can teach them.
From the original 40 titles, we've counted down your great book's top 10. Time now to reveal what's made it to the top of the pile.
I couldn't be more pleased with the book that you have voted #1. My personal copy is very well thumbed. It's become a classic, a coming-of-age novel that brilliantly deals with racial prejudice in America's Deep South in the 1930s. Your comments on our website say it all.
The best book anyone entering teaching could read. If children only ever read one book, it would have to be this one. A book that reminds us that children are sometimes smarter than adults. And that book, voted #1, is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, a blockbuster novel that became a hit film.
Tom, did you rape Mayella Ewell? I did not, sir.
The Oscar-winning movie starring Gregory Peck may look a little dated these days, but I think Harper Lee's classic novel deserves its place at the top of our poll. And I'm not alone. A survey in America found that next to the Bible, To Kill a Mockingbird was the book most cited as making a difference. So what is so memorable about this 30 million copy selling Pulitzer Prize-winning book? It's set in a small town in Alabama in the mid-1930s. The narrator of the story is a white girl who would have been 9 in 1935, as Harper Lee was. The narrator's father, Atticus Finch, is the town's lawyer. He defends a black man wrongly accused of the rape of a white woman.
In our courts, all men are created equal.
Atticus is the hero of the book, a wise, courteous, modest man who shows great moral and physical courage in the face of the vicious and potentially murderous racism which the case arouses.
He took advantage of me!
Despite the terrible gravity of the story, To Kill a Mockingbird is a book full of charm and humour. And to the teacher, Harper Lee seems to be saying that true learning goes way beyond narrow schooling to the kind of human understanding without which we are lost. As she writes, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. This is a truly great book, and I'm glad that so many of you thought so too.
To Kill a Mockingbird is a brilliant read. I recommend it to everyone. Fantastic.
It is, of course, a very good book.
So Shazia Mirza has joined us, and she was once a former teacher. She's now a stand-up comedian and is here to support To Kill a Mockingbird.
That's correct.
You remember when you first read it?
I remember. I was about 11 and I wasn't given a choice. We were forced to read it. It was that or the Bible, so we picked To Kill a Mockingbird. You know, we did plays on it. I dressed up as Harper Lee. We did projects on it, posters on it, paintings on it. We had discussions and role play on it. It was like, this is a really important book in your life. Let's study it to death.
To Kill a Mockingbird is a book that a lot of people encounter as a set text at GCSE, and it's very popular and they like it and enjoy it at that point. So I'm not surprised to see it as a book that people think has inspired them.
I was brought up in Birmingham where everybody was friends. There was no racism then. And so it wasn't, I didn't really relate to it then. But our teachers always used to say to us, no, you know, this is what happens in life and you can take some lessons from this and you can learn it and interpret it. Later on in my life, I realised why it's an important book. You know, it's not just a story. I mean, it does happen to people. And so that reality is an attachment to you when you're reading it. So I can understand why it's #1.
How does your take on racism and what you do in your stand-up act relate to this book, To Kill a Mockingbird?
Well, obviously the book was set in Alabama in the 1930s, and when I was 12 I'd never been to America, but I have now. And I do this thing in my stand-up routine where I say, oh, you know, I was in New York and I was walking down the street and this man shouted out, he went, "Oi, you Paki, go back to India." And I thought, oh my God, you know, you have to admire racists these days because they're not even trying to be accurate.
Well, To Kill a Mockingbird got such a phenomenal response. We had one teacher who rang us up and pleaded with us to be allowed to come on the programme because he was so thrilled that it got to the #1 position. Hello, Tony Talbot. Now, why was the book so important to you that you wanted to come on today and tell us about it?
Well, I first remember the book in 1980 as a student studying it and eventually going on to teach it. And what struck me then was the fact that this was a book that was so simply written, but yet it was highlighting so many themes and issues that are so relevant today around gender, race, power, inequality and things like that. And of course it's beautifully written and very simply written through the eyes of a little girl.
But what is it about this book that's made people vote for it in such overwhelming numbers for their #1 book?
It shows, I suppose, that people are taking these sorts of issues very seriously. Teachers, that is, taking it very seriously. And it remains a very powerful book. So yes, I was very pleased, very thrilled that it became #1 and also very surprised.
Well, we're delighted you're on the programme today. Thank you, Tony.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you to all of you who took part in our Great Book Survey. We've enjoyed it so much. And who knows, one day we'll be back to do some more. Until then, goodbye.
Great Books is sponsored by the National Union of Teachers, the voice of the profession.